Good afternoon. The Bay Area is a hotbed of innovation in the healthcare arena. From advances in bioscience and medical devices such as digital wearables, to new models for capturing patient information and organizing the delivery of healthcare, we are at the cutting edge of using technology to improve the consumer and patient experience. Nationally, we see a huge investment in this arena. Digital health funding in 2013 was up 39% from 2012. Biotech was the second largest sector in 2013 for venture capitalist investment. And over half of the venture-backed IPOs in 2013 were in biotech. Accenture is proud to be working with the Bay Area Council to highlight the importance of innovation and technology in healthcare to achieve the goals of controlling healthcare costs, expanding access, and improving quality of care. For more than 2 decades, Accenture Life Sciences has been helping our clients rethink, reshape, and restructure for better patient outcomes. The world's leading healthcare providers and health plans choose Accenture for a wide range of insight-driven health services that help use knowledge in new ways from the back office to the doctor's office. We have about 26,000 professionals who are dedicated to support our clients around the world in managing the challenges and opportunities brought about as a result of the ever-changing healthcare landscape. Opportunities and challenges such as the legislative requirements, the continuing rise of healthcare costs, the increase in chronic disease state, and some would say the most important increased focus on the patient as the consumer. Today, we're going to see some real-world examples of how innovation and technology are changing the way we experience healthcare. To do that, we have assembled some of the most important industry leaders that are pioneering the development of technologies that hold promise for both improving our lives and reducing the burden of healthcare costs on business. So now let me briefly introduce my panelists and ask them to join me here on stage. First, Kim Popovits, who is the CEO of Genomic Health. Kim? Chris Haskell, the head of U.S. Science Hub, Bayer Healthcare. Chris? Dr. Pat Basu, who is the Chief Medical Officer of Doctors on Demand. And lastly, Manish Kothar, who is the Project Director for Robotics and Health Technology for SR International. And before we get started, we'd like to pose a question to the audience. And the question is, or I should say the questions are, what is your greatest hope and what is your greatest concern regarding healthcare and technology? So you can use your smartphones to text your answers, and we're going to roll them during the presentation. With that, Kim, would you like to share some perspectives on technology and innovation from the Genomic Health perspective?
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to just take a few minutes, and I thought maybe the best way to describe what we're doing at Genomic Health and how it's impacting the care of cancer would be to show you just a couple of examples of the tests that we've created by using biology to layer over population-based statistics to more finely tune therapies for patients. And I've always been a believer that most good novels, movies, whatever, start with problems, a plot, a conflict, and this one certainly does. So back to kind of what situation are we trying to solve here? You know, where is the plot? When we look today at cancer across America, and could arguably say across the world, the issue that we have at hand that we're trying to resolve here is we have very large patient populations. And so when we started Genomic Health, we said, what are the compelling questions? What are the huge needs across the care of cancer? And it was quickly brought up to us by oncologists around the country that we have these large patient populations diagnosed with early stage disease and we really don't know what to do with them. But in fact, what we are doing is treating them very aggressively because we don't want to miss that patient that does need the chemotherapy or that does need the aggressive surgery. So when you look at what's happening across, and specifically here, breast, colon, and prostate cancer, the treatments that you see in the next bar up are the treatments that are typically used, and you see those percentages are very high. So absent tools that can really individualize a patient's care and really look at their individual tumors in an individual way, or basically what I always say is taking a molecular fingerprint of their tumor, this is what happens. And you see those numbers are pretty high. 70% of women getting chemotherapy for early stage breast cancer. We know from the data that only 1 in 4 in 100 women will actually benefit from chemotherapy that have early stage breast cancer. And that's a pretty shocking statistic. And most people will say, well, that really can't be true, can it? Because I'm sure everybody in this room knows somebody that's gone through chemotherapy treatment for early stage breast cancer, but in fact, that's correct. The reason that we treat 70% of the patients, when we know only 4 in 100 benefit, is we don't know who the 4 are. So we offer the treatment to everybody. That's a problem. And that's what we call one-size-fits-all medicine. And that's the problem that we were trying to solve at Genomic Health. Similarly, if you look at colon cancer and prostate cancers, there's issue around chemotherapy treatment, but also around aggressive surgeries that come with significant lifelong consequences. So as we look to the side effects that come with these treatments, the cost to society that comes with these treatments, huge dollars go in here. The average cancer therapeutic works about 20 to 25% of the time. We will spend $80 billion this year in cancer therapeutics, so just do that math, a waste of about $70 billion. And just imagine where those dollars could be reapportioned to do a better job in reallocating healthcare resources in our country alone, and certainly around the world. So the punchline here is that might have all been fine if we were curing cancer, but in fact we're doing this and these are the results that we're getting. So we're having a very minimal benefit with all of this overtreatment. So bring in Genomic Health, and we started in breast cancer to say, can we tackle this question around chemotherapy benefit? Which patients need it? And can we spare those that aren't benefiting from a toxic treatment and a costly one to society in many ways? So to give you an example, these are the questions we set out to answer. A startup company, a relatively limited amount of resources, so we couldn't grab all these questions at the same time. We started in breast. We've been at it now for about 14 years, and we've moved in now to colon cancer and prostate cancer. So making progress, albeit slower than we might all like. Clearly, we're seeing an impact in what our tests are doing for the healthcare system. This is an example, and I think visually it can kind of help you think about what's happening in breast cancer. So these are the 100 women I mentioned. If we didn't have the ability to look at their tumor at the individual level, if we were just using population type criteria, what would happen and was happening prior to Oncotype DX being available is most of these women, 62% of these women, this was a study that was done, it's a large meta-analysis, would be getting chemotherapy. What happens now when we lay the information from our test, which looks at the tumor at a genomic level, what we see is that shifts. And so after using the test, what we're finding is treatment decisions change about 37% of the time. And what you see there is many of those figures in red turn to green. Those women would now not be receiving chemotherapy. But importantly, and I mentioned, this is the overtreatment or overuse of chemotherapy for breast cancer, but what we can also find, if you see the 4 women in that bottom row that went from green to red, those are women that would have been recommended no chemotherapy. By the nature of their tumor, the size of it, the grade of it, by all standards that we had today, those patients would have been told, you don't need chemotherapy, you have a very low-risk cancer, and in fact, we can tell them that they have a very high-risk cancer. In those patients, our test actually becomes life-saving. So we think about cost savings or it being cost-effective. In this case, it becomes life-saving for these women that are appropriately diagnosed that need aggressive treatment. So the other example I want to walk through is prostate cancer. This is the newest test that we've launched. It was last year. This is a huge need and most would say it's probably the largest need in men's health today, if not one of the largest needs in healthcare. The problem here is that most men will do fine by doing nothing, by monitoring their disease. Men hear prostate cancer. What do they want to do? They want to be aggressive, just like anybody would hearing the word cancer. So the question here is, how can I confidently choose active surveillance, which is a management plan for them. It's not saying do nothing. It's saying let's watch your disease differently. What we know, and again, think back into that breast cancer example, if there was no genomic classifier, what would happen today for prostate cancer patients is they would be told, based on NCCN, which is a cancer risk criteria, that this is where they would sit versus a population. Well, now that's good. You're being told that you either have low risk or a very low risk or an intermediate risk disease, but you're basically being told that based on a large pool of patients that have been studied. Now, if you look at what happens when we here also can add genomic information on top, for some of these men, we're telling them that you're exactly where the population criteria would have said you should be. Now, that's not important because at least they know that what I've been diagnosed as and what my biology is saying is accurate, and that helps me make my treatment plan. So again, most are never gonna die from this disease, but the fear that if they get their prostate removed, that they'll actually see a worse cancer than was revealed in their biopsy causes them to get over treatment. So men are making this decision based on a core biopsy. They're often told that if we do the surgery and remove your prostate, we're likely going to see a little bit worse disease. That happens in maybe 10, 20, 30, 40% of men. So that alone will drive men to overtreatment. If you layer this genomic information on now and you watch how this shifts, you'll see, just like with breast cancer, patients that are believed to be low risk or intermediate risk are actually lower risk. They can really confidently choose active surveillance. And again, just like we saw in breast cancer, we'll find some patients that are low risk that move to a little higher risk, and they may want to manage their disease a little differently or be more aggressive. So it's my last slide here, but it's just a way to show you that this is how we can use genomics in doing robust clinical studies and looking at large populations of patients reproducibly, demonstrating that we're able to predict which patients have more aggressive cancers and which patients should move to more aggressive treatment. So I'll stop there and we can talk on the panel about some of the more exciting things we have going forward. Thank you.
Chris?
Hello. Thanks very much to the Bay Area Council for also having Bayer Healthcare here to talk a little bit today. Bayer Healthcare is part of a 150-year-old Bayer organization. As you can imagine, for a pharma organization this size, we have very much a global presence. But I think what's important, especially for this audience in the Bay Area Council, is that we only have a few places where we put our research and development. Of course, we still have a significant amount of research back in the Wupper Valley, in northern Germany, where aspirin was invented. But our North American research presence sits right here in Mission Bay, San Francisco. And why did we do this? This was just a strategic decision. Partly because the Bay Area, as you probably know, is the birthplace of the innovation in the new era of healthcare with Genentech and the other companies. And it continues to be a driver for innovation in this area, where you have, of course, the incredible academic institutions. And as you heard in Monica's introduction, an amazing amount of influx still happening with the venture capital funding, pulling innovations out of these academic centers. There are, I think, 860 life science companies in the Bay Area. What's interesting is that there's 60% of these are 50 people or less, meaning that there's a lot of emerging innovation here that's looking for ways to impact healthcare, impact the patient in the end. Some of these, like Genomic Health, have managed to make it. Some of them are looking for better ways and other ways to partner to find ways to move forward. So what's the problem in healthcare? Well, the problem is that it's a really long, expensive process. If you look here at an example of the sort of the triage we do in developing new medicines for patients, you can see the process from the early idea to the time that you actually bring a medicine to the patient is over 10 years. And if you look at the aggregate R&D costs that it takes to bring one successful drug forward, it's over $1 billion per successful drug. I guess I learned an hour ago that if we have more 4-year-olds doing this, maybe it would be a lot better, but we tend to have adults doing this R&D, so this is where we sit. My job at Bayer is to lead a group called the Science Hub that's looking to partner with these early innovators in this region, in the greater US area, to try to bring more improvements in how we adapt new technologies to improve on this process. And if I were to bring up, I guess, 3 examples here to close out that we can, before we get to the panel, of areas where I see technologies that are just now starting to come and impact how we do drug development and also how we deliver medicines to patients. I would say that the first one's big data. The second one is personalized or precision medicine. And the third one is really gene therapy. And you've probably heard that a long time ago, and I'll tell you why it's ready now. But big data is really the ability to query biological systems in a robust and very deep way. If you think about the Human Genome Project, that was certainly an example of this. What we're doing now is with the reduction in cost and the increase in speed on genomic analysis, we're able to take this type of systems and query things like cancers. And in fact, the Cancer Genome Atlas is a national consortium where they're attempting to essentially genotype and fingerprint the over 200 different subtypes of cancers that are out there. This obviously helps in being able to identify which patients should get what medicine, but it also helps us in designing the medicines that will specifically impact the patients. So the big data allows us to have precision medicine, which is the right patient having the right drug at the right time. Genomic Health is coming up with the tools by which we can measure that for patients. But this also helps us steer the types of drugs that we put through the drug development process. And then the third innovation is gene therapy. And I think this is an interesting one because 20 years ago, this gene therapy was a technology that was 10 years away, and it seemed like it was always going to be 10 years away. In fact, the first patient was dosed, and the first gene therapy trial was in 1990 in the US. Here we are 20 years later, and just last year, the first gene therapy was approved in Europe for lipolipase deficiency, but it doesn't matter, but it's a very small orphan disease. But what's important is that there are many more clinical trials now, and you're seeing gene therapies having impact in these clinical trials in patients with hemophilia, with congenital blindness. So this is now, looks like it's actually on the cusp of a technology that will change how patients see medicine. So big data, personalized medicine, and gene therapy, I think are changing how we are developing new drugs. It also changes how we pick which drugs patients are getting, and also changes how patients will think about what medicine is.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks so much for sharing your afternoon with us. Before I started, it's a little hard for me to see. I actually wanted to understand our audience a little bit better. If you could raise your hand if you own a smartphone or have access to the internet. All right, good. Thank you. Thanks for turning the lights up. And one more question. Raise your hand if you think it is sometimes a pain to go to the doctor's office, or if you ever thought there has to be an easier way of doing this. All right, great. So if you didn't raise your hand, come see me after the talk. I'd love to learn more about that. Position myself, it's even hard for me to get in there. With Doctor on Demand, we definitely have a lot of aspirational visions. One of which is something I've spent a lot of my career working on, which is eradication. Only in this case, it's not a virus or cancer, but to eradicate the waiting room. One of our goals is, 10 years from now to look back and say, we used to have these things called waiting rooms where we took a bunch of healthy people, put them in a room with some sick people, turned the heat up, let them bake in there for an hour, and wondered why everyone came out sick. So jokes aside, I'll tell you a little bit about Doctor on Demand. A lot of value propositions, two of the foremost are definitely something that Monica addressed in her introductory remarks, is really for the first time to look at the patient as an end consumer of healthcare as a service. So a service not designed to make my life easier as a physician or a corporation or insurance company, but really thinking about how we look at the patient as the end user of a service. Nowadays in the United States, depending on the study that you read, say it's about, average is 3 weeks to get into a doctor's, to get in for an appointment. Door to door, by the time you return back to your office or you return home, it's roughly 3 hours to do that. So certainly from a service perspective, compared to traditional analog healthcare, this provides a dramatic increase in service level. And then at the individual price points compared to emergency rooms, urgent care, or our traditional offices, it is much cheaper at the individual level and certainly much cheaper at the aggregate system level. So a common question would be, what can we use this for? And you'd be surprised. A non-eloquent saying, but one we use in medicine is common things are common, and it is true that many of the billion plus ambulatory visits in the United States every year are for very common conditions. coughs, colds, flu, UTIs, pediatric questions, fevers, rashes. These are some of the tens of thousands of cases that we've already treated very, very successfully with dramatic satisfaction, dramatic outcomes on the part of patients and physicians. With that, this summer, we'll be offering other provider types. One of the philosophies I tell our physicians is the value is not necessarily in the doctor's office, but in the doctor. And so similarly, we will be connecting patients with Doctor on Demand with psychologists for behavioral therapy, with nutrition and RDs for weight loss, and for genetic counselors as well. So just as an example, we can track all sorts of metrics, data on quality of physicians. We can see what patients are calling for. Obviously, this is from February. You can see that, irrespective of age, we treated a lot of common conditions. Again, upper respiratory infections, urinary tract infections, fever, earaches, etc. I could, speak at length about all the different, attributes that Doctor on Demand brings, but if the video plays, I will let somebody more famous than me do this.
With Doctor on Demand, you FaceTime with a doctor from your computer, smartphone, or tablet, which is great news for anyone with an iPhone, an Android, or a public library where they can press their junk up against a webcam. Folks, this app is going to revolutionize medicine. It's designed to modernize the healthcare system by using mobile technology to make a simple doctor's visit stress-free for patients and doctors alike. Yes, it's less stressful for everyone. You really think your doctor enjoys cupping your balls? No. Now he can watch you do it yourself. Once you connect with the doctor, you can even upload photos for them to examine. In fact, the only thing you can't do is send a stool sample. Learned that one the hard way. Ruined a perfectly good headphone jack.
I thought this afternoon you guys might need a little humor, so he can do it better than me. So looking forward to the panel. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. That's a hard act to follow. I'm from SRI. We're a research shop which tends to think 5-10 years in the future. And a lot of work that's been discussed here is really focused on improving quality, removing unnecessary demand, streamlining the demand-supply curve. At the end of the day, it is a very simple case of supply and demand. There's more people who need physician visits than there is a supply for them. You can go back to the medicine man, or you can try and find a different way to do it. This problem is already evident. If you look at today, and if you just look at the right, the 27% of lab visits within the last 2 years have given an incorrect result. That's a lot. So there's a need for automation already today. What we do at SRI is really think about what we can do 5-10 years in the future. So we've really focused on robotics and talking about how robotics can maybe change healthcare 5-10 years in the future. Today, a robot, if you looked at the DARPA Robotics Challenge, which Google bought the company that won the challenge last year, you'll see that it looks great, but if you look really carefully, they've sped up the video around 20 to 50 times. These robots take around a minute to walk a foot. They're not going to be working in anybody's house helping with healthcare anytime soon. Robotics really today is where I would say the computer industry was in the early 80s, just getting together. The components are getting cheaper. Hackers essentially are putting things together. The software is coming together. What we've really been focusing on is driving down the cost. That's really been our focus for the last 5-10 years. We've been developing a lot of low-cost, high-reliability components. We've been adding manipulation capabilities, because at the end of the day, when you go to a doctor's office to quote what was just said, they do things like cup your and stuff like that. So you need manipulation capabilities. Just having no manipulation makes it difficult to poke and prod and figure out what's right or wrong. And eventually you need improved navigation, because if you want to put these robots in the home, which is where we're really moving towards, the medical home, they need to be able to move about. If it's assisted living care, they can move about one way. If it's a home, they need to navigate stairs. Those things can't be done today, but they're getting easier and easier. Robotics is really where I would say the electronics and computer industry was in the late 80s, just starting to move away from do-it-yourselfers to starting to become kind of commercial enterprise. So some of the things we've been working on. So the DARPA Robotics Challenge was for able to do a set of tasks. DARPA came to us and said, can you build a robot that can not necessarily do all the tasks, but be built under $100,000 or under $50,000 and work 10 times faster than the other robots? That's what we're working on at SRI. It's the first robot with total physical awareness. It knows where to go, how to go. It integrates elements of big data into the element of understanding where to do things within the house. Why is this important for healthcare? If you're in assisted living care, you don't need the legs. The floor plans are pretty well laid out. Put it on some wheels. But you may need to give the woman with rheumatoid arthritis and diabetes an insulin shot. There's no reason that that can't be done. The proxy system has been designed from ground up to be able to handle those sort of healthcare needs. I don't have the video here, but this got 1 million views. I should have put it in. This got 1 million views last week on Yahoo. We've started to build an army of robots. These are all smaller, around 1/4 of a dime size. We're building thousands of them. And they sit on a flex circuit. They can go up and down walls. They can go around and around. They can follow the Mobius strip. You can make pharmaceuticals with these. We've actually made pharmaceuticals with them. You can build trusses, and if you wanted to build wind turbines, going back to the earlier session here, you can do that too. So these concepts are now coming into place. Like when you start doing labs and trying to reduce errors, you have different opportunities. Levitating micro robots that cost a penny each to make. This can change the curve of the supply and demand curve. And finally, I'll end with a third thing. So we've been taking these robotic technologies and migrating it down. All of you have seen Avatar, these big, clumsy, fun movie, but big, clumsy exosuits. Can you imagine your grandmother putting on an exosuit? It will take 2 hours to put it on. You walk for half an hour, and then 2 hours to take it off. We've been really focused on building exomuscle, suits very smartly designed with very smart materials and motors in them that can, taken from robotics, that can now make somebody who has difficulty getting out of a chair, that's their main difficulty, be able to get out of the chair easily. You don't need assisted living care. Again, you've shifted the supply-demand curve. So is the robot going to be in? We definitely think so, and we think it's going to be in within the next few years, at least in some of these indications. Thank you.
So I committed to the council that we would end on time at 5 o'clock, and given the breadth of the discussion here, I could ask my esteemed colleagues hundreds of questions, as I'm sure you are, given the interesting things they're doing and their perspective. But in the 5 minutes or so that we have left, I'm going to try to capture a couple of questions based upon what I heard. And my first question, feel free, anyone and all, is really around, based upon what we heard, where do we really see the changes in the doctor-patient relationship? And it's probably not the doctor-patient relationship anymore, it's really the doctor-consumer relationship, and get some perspective on that. Manish, you want to start?
I mean, there's a couple of physicians here who are probably better equipped to answer than me, but I'll start by saying that, at least from a robotic side, a dumb robot won't work. I mean, the example I would give is when I listen to somebody's voice, I don't have to see them. I know who it is. Mm-hmm. I know who the patient is the second time they would come back, or my doctor knows who I am the second time I come back. Those are all features that need to be added. This is where the analytics and other elements come in. So I would say those are very important components to the success of maintaining it. So I don't think the relationship is going to completely change. We just need to find ways to enable technology to repeat some of those features into the system. But I'll pass it on.
Sure. I would just add that, sometimes we think that because, technology might get in the way, it might, change or reduce the doctor-patient relationship. If you actually look at status quo medicine, a small fraction of our time actually spent with patients is actually in diagnosis and therapy. Some of these technologies, whether it's robotics, whether it's diagnostic testing, certainly what we measure very carefully with Doctor on Demand is the amount of time that doctors actually spent spend thinking about the diagnosis and the advice and the prescription, the therapy is much, much higher than some of the other ancillary tasks and other things that we spend most of our time doing, again, in 2014 medicine. So I actually think technology can actually bring us closer together.
Yeah, I think in many cases the patient's becoming more educated. They're taking a lot of this in their own hands. Certainly at the upper end, they're pushing the medical system with that. They're getting their own genome sequence. They're learning about genomic health. They're demanding these types of decisions be put into place. And I think that's going to drive the physicians to also be educated in this area and probably hopefully push the whole thing forward to where we're all making better decisions.
Kim, did you have any comments?
I would just say I agree. I think that consumers are going to be much more informed. I think the technology is going to allow us to have a much richer conversation. I think the missing piece right now is we haven't effectively built the tools and the internet, so to speak, to take this very complex information to a level that the average physician and patient can have a rich and meaningful conversation. So it gets back to how actionable can we make it in changing clinical practice today and in the future.
Most definitely. You know, the hypothesis is innovation often is far ahead of a public policy. And as we think about technology and what we heard today, kind of what's your perspective on, you know, where we are with public policy and innovation, and we think about the key issues here in healthcare around privacy and ethics. Any comments, panelists?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab as somebody who's worked in policy before. I think that is very accurate. Oftentimes, you know, our laws have been written for, you know, the 1990s in terms of medicine. As an example, you know, when I treat a patient in Illinois or in Indiana, is the medicine so different that I need to go through multiple licensure and pay for, you know, more licenses, and some of the just the state-specific barriers, I think, has not caught up. A second area that we encounter sometimes are, you know, defining what is the doctor-patient relationship. You know, the law has moved significantly in a more progressive fashion now that in many states, you know, the video connection is becoming more and more codified as constituting that sort of exam. So I think it's getting there, but it is, as you suggested, oftentimes definitely a few years behind.
Most definitely. Other comments?
I think it's one of the biggest barriers we have, both from a regulation standpoint, an access standpoint, and reimbursement issues around getting access to these tests. Our systems, and this is a good problem, I think we've created a problem that we have to help solve, but we have, you know, 21st century medicine being regulated and policies that were built for 20th century medicine, and the technology has moved us so far that we have to retool. We're going to have to do things differently, and we have to help to get that done because we don't have the resources sitting, you know, everywhere in the FDA and in Washington and where policies are formed to really handle what's coming at people.
Yeah, I would agree that from our perspective, one of the biggest challenges is the regulatory environment and trying to update this process of how we get drugs tested through humans into market. Precision medicine will allow us to have more precise trials, have them faster, have rolling regulatory approvals where you have an early approval, but you have more monitoring where, you know, an organization like ours will work with the regulatory agencies like the FDA to make sure that we're tracking the progress of the drug. But it's about trying to get the good therapies to patients faster. And it's something we have to work together on.
You think about the whole, you laid out a nice slide on the clinical trial process, but imagine how different that's going to look when we can do.
It already is a bit, but it's very challenging.
I think one of the complexities here is when a physician looks at a patient, they're using a mix of strong signals or precise signals like the tests and a number of weak signals. Weak signals about are their toenails dirty because that tells them that they're not taking care of themselves, for example. You know, data analytics and big data provides a large amount of weak signals that one could use, but the regulations and policies around how one could use those weak signals in medicine is a completely unknown, and I can imagine that being a very controversial field over the next 5 years, frankly, not even 10.
Most definitely. Your, you know, the comment about the investment, the opportunity in the innovation and the impact on care, as well as, you know, the regulation, and then, you know, quite candidly, you know, will investment still come in given those constraints associated with regulation? So I don't know about the rest of you, but I could ask these folks 100 more questions on my list, but I'm getting the red flashlight, which I generally means it's time for us to end. So again, I thank you all for participating. Very interesting discussion, very interesting perspective. And I think, Jim, you're going to close us out tonight? Great.
Thank you.